Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to talk about PPE requirements for the workplace. And first of all, for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Doug Sully. I am the owner of Sully Safety Services based in Mississauga, Ontario. I work with a lot of small to medium-sized businesses to help them comply with their health and safety laws and requirements. We also have Ray Snow, president of HeartZap Safety Training and Equipment. HeartZap provides a variety of different first aid equipment as well as training services on first aid, Joint Health and Safety Committee, working at heights. And I can let Ray take the floor here for a minute to kind of elaborate on that. So.
Welcome everybody to the webinar. Anything from health and safety training that you're going to need in the workplace, we offer throughout not only Ontario, but throughout Canada. So if you do have locations in other parts of Canada, we can certainly combine your training programs for you right across. Any questions, just let us know.
Okay, so we'll get started here. I'm just going to bring up the presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. We figure the presentation should be about a half hour, so we should have a good 10-15 minutes or so for any questions that might arise. So if you aren't already on mute, could you please make sure that you're on mute, as we'd like to reduce any feedback that may come during the presentation. So today we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about PPE requirements for the workplace. Personal protective equipment is extremely valuable when it comes to protecting workers. However, it is the last line of defense. It does come as part of a well-rounded hazard control program for your workplace. So we'll start with some legislative requirements, and then we'll get into the general types of PPE. We'll talk about storage, inspection, maintenance, and repair, as well as disposal and employer responsibilities. So to start with, we'll start with the legislation. So Section 25 of the Health and Safety Act is the employer's responsibilities, and the employer is required to ensure the equipment, materials, and protective devices as prescribed are provided and maintained in good condition. They also need to make sure the measures and procedures are prescribed are carried out in the workplace, and the equipment, materials, and protective devices provided are used as prescribed by the law, as well as the employer's policies. Regulation 851 is your industrial establishment regulation. So this regulation applies to almost every workplace except for construction. So section 79 to 86 lists the requirements for PPE in the workplace. So a worker is required to wear or use any protective clothing, equipment, or device, and must be instructed and trained on how to wear that and use the equipment. Any worker that's exposed to a hazard of head injury must wear head protection. A worker exposed to the hazard of eye injury must wear eye protection. A worker exposed to the hazard of foot injury shall wear foot protection. Long hair must be suitably confined to prevent entanglement with any rotating shaft or open, unguarded equipment. Jewelry, oh my God, or clothing that is loose or dangling, or rings shall not be worn near any rotating shaft, spindle, gear, belt, or other source of entanglement. And a worker that is exposed to the hazard of injury from contact to the worker's skin by any substance must wear proper apparel to protect their hands. If a worker is exposed to the hazard of falling and the surface to which he or she might fall is more than 3 meters below the position where he or she is situated, the worker shall wear a serviceable safety belt or harness and lifeline that is adequately secured to a fixed support, and so arranged that the worker cannot fall freely from a vertical distance of more than 1.5 meters. And finally, where a worker is exposed to the hazard of falling into liquid that is sufficient depth for a life jacket or other personal flotation device to be effective as protection, they must be worn to prevent the risk of drowning. Regulation 21391 is your construction projects. So section 21 and to 27 deals specifically with PPE on a construction site. So any worker must wear protective clothing and use PPE or devices as necessary to protect the worker against the hazards to which the worker may be exposed. A worker is required to wear protective clothing or use PPE or devices. They must also be adequately instructed and trained to wear it before they actually wear it. Any worker on any construction site or any work that is deemed as construction must have a hard hat on at all times while on the project. Every worker shall always wear protective footwear when on a project. A worker shall use protection appropriate in the circumstance when there's a risk of eye injury to the worker. And a worker shall use protection appropriate in the circumstance when there's contact to the worker's skin. Sorry, my apologies here. A worker must also wear adequate fall protection when falling more than 3 meters, falling more than 1.2 meters if the work area is used for a wheelbarrow or equipment, falling into operating machinery, falling into water or another liquid, falling into or onto a hazardous substance and object, or falling through an opening on a work surface. The worker shall wear a life jacket or other personal flotation device that is adequate to make sure the worker is exposed to a risk of drowning on a project. It is not reasonably possible to install a guardrail section, and it's not reasonably possible to protect the worker adequately by means of fall protection, as listed in section 26. So I have really kind of tried to summarize what the law says. We could probably spend an hour here on each of the sections and subsections, but I have provided the applicable location for the different types of requirements. So let's talk about the different types. So first things first, safety boots. So the CSA standard Z19514 is the standard for safety boots in the workplace. You must make sure that safety boots are CSA approved grade 1 minimum. You'll see a green triangle on the safety boots in this case. You also will see safety boots that have an orange omega ohm symbol on a white tag. This is assistance with regards to electrical hazards on a job site, and in construction, your green triangle as well as white tag are required on your safety boots as a bare minimum. It can be boots, or if you are in an industrial establishment, it can also be shoes. What you need to keep in mind is you need to make sure that they protect the foot as well as potentially the ankle. So on a construction site, the boots must come up at least 6 inches above the bottom of your foot. So this way it also protects your ankle as well from any potential cut hazards. Safety boots must be worn when any hazard to feet may be present. My rule of thumb is always, unless it hinders the actual work that can be done, they need to be worn, whether it's an industrial establishment or whether it is a construction project. And if you are on site without them, there is a significant fine of $400 per person who does not have them on as a bare minimum. Make sure that you have the proper type for the work performed, workplace or industry, and make sure they're in good condition, they fit properly, they're non-slip, and they're laced up. Walking around with safety boots that aren't laced up is the same thing as basically walking around with nothing, and the trip hazard is significant. The next one we'll talk about here is hard hats. So the CSA standard Z94.1-15 is your hard hat CSA standard. They must be worn on all times on construction sites, regardless of the work. The type that you'll need for a construction site is your Class E Type 2. And they must also be worn whenever there's a potential for head injury present in industrial establishments. This will be your Class G. You must avoid wearing things like hats, toques, do-rags, bandanas, or anything that could hinder the actual fit of the hard hat on the head. Do not paint the hard hats or alter the hard hats in any way. If you are going to use any sort of stickers on your hard hat for any reason, please make sure that they do not jeopardize the integrity of the hard hat. And if the hard hat is struck while on a construction site by something that's falling from above, the hard hat needs to be replaced regardless of whether it looks like it's still okay. If you would like to get it recertified by a manufacturer, you can do that. And once they've done that, they will be capable of being able to be used on site again. With regards to gloves and protection of skin, CSA standard 29609 is your hand protection standard. There's different types that you'll find in the workplace for different applications. You may have leather or neoprene, latex, nitrile, or even PVC. You need to review the work area and review the work that's performed to determine the different types of gloves required. You can also reference documents such as your safety data sheets for chemicals and reference regulations, standards, and guidelines that have been released for the different types of work that could be performed. With regards to ear protection, you have your CSA standard Z94 2-14. There's different types of ear protection. There's earplugs, which are inserted into the ear canal, and it may be custom or general. You have semi-insert earplugs, where it is 2 earplugs held over the ends of the ear canal by a rigid headband. And you have your ear muffs, which consist of sound attenuating material and soft ear cushions that fit around the ear or hard outer cups, and they're held together by a headband. You need to make sure that the ear protection that you provide, make sure that it fits the worker properly. Providing them with ear protection that basically hangs off of their head is not sufficient, as it'll just fall off. Making sure that earbuds and earplugs, making sure that they also fit properly into the ear. Testing to make sure the worker can hear anything. Headphones are not an acceptable substitute for ear protection. You also need to ensure that they're cleaned regularly with mild soap and water, and you need to dispose of them after each use unless they are reusable ear protection. Eye protection can come in various different forms. CSA standard Z94.302 is your eye and face protector standard. There's different classes. Your class 1 will be your spectacles. Your class 2 will be your goggles. Class 3 are your welding helmets. Class 4 are your welding hand shields. Class 5 are your hoods. Class 6 are your face shields, and class 7 are your respirator face pieces. These can be your half or full face. You need to reference the regulations, standards, and guidelines specific to your workplace to determine which type of mask or eye or face protection is required. You need to also reference safety data sheets, specifically section 7, which is your exposure, controls, and personal protection. You need to make sure that you reference that area as well to determine if a specific type of mask is required. Proper eye protection reduces the risk of injury to eyes. If there's any sort of potential for risk of injury to the eyes, then eye protection must be worn, whether on a construction site or whether in an industrial establishment. Look, reflective clothing is another one that comes in. CSA standard Z9615 is your standard for high visibility safety apparel. There are 3 different classes. There's class 1, which is a low risk. Your class 2 is your low to medium risk, and your class 3 is high risk. This type of clothing and equipment is required when moving vehicles or equipment are present, or there's low light and visibility. This can be dependent on the risk for the type of vest that's required. You need to check your regulations and standards and guidelines that are applicable to the workplace. If you are on a construction site, you are going to be looking at a class 2, especially when there are vehicles present in the workplace. Okay. So let's talk about masks. There are some different types of masks. You have your non-surgical masks at this point. They're normally worn in healthcare settings or any areas where biohazardous infectious materials may be present. You have your N95 masks, which provide a bit more protection from things such as dust and chemicals. And you have your respirators, which are required in specific situations. You need to ensure that the type of mask used is fit for the purpose of the work. You're not going to use a non-surgical mask when you're handling specific chemicals. Currently at this point, your non-surgical mask is your minimum requirements with regards to COVID for your workplace. And your respirators are going to be used for more things like handling chemicals directly or coming into contact with potential infectious diseases, as well as even handling things such as concrete, drywall dust, and things like that as well. So. The respirator protection falls under CSA standard Z94.4-11, which is the selection, use, and care of respirators. There's two different types. There's air supplied or air purifying, and you also have your half face, which is the one pictured there. And you also have full face, which will have a face shield attached to it. When you are using respirators in the workplace, you need to have a proper respiratory protection program set up. This includes specific procedures. This includes specific procedures on protection. This includes fit, inspection, maintenance, cleaning, as well as training for workers on what they need to be aware of, including different chemicals they may come in contact with, emergency procedures, as well as the actual fit of the respirator. So before a respirator can be used in the workplace, a fit test is required. This can be a couple of different options. There's a qualitative fit test as well as a quantitative fit test. The qualitative fit test uses a couple of different types of test chemicals and a hood. Your quantitative involves the use of a port account machine. Written documentation is required for the actual fit test being completed, as well as your respiratory program details. And emergency escape respirators, they must be kept separate and they must not be used unless it is in fact an emergency. Keeping a respirator on site for someone who may forget theirs, they shouldn't be going to use the emergency respirator. They should actually be going home because they're not bringing their proper PPE to the site. You also have your fall protection. This one comes in regards to industrial establishments as well as construction, which is always the one that's in the news. There are a variety of different CSA standards that apply to the use of fall protection and different components. You have your Z259-105, which is your body belts and saddles. Your 259.2.512, which is fall arresters and vertical lifelines. Z259 2.2-98, which is your self-retracting devices. Then you have your descent control devices, your full body harnesses, energy absorbers and lanyards, connecting components for personal fall arrest systems, and fall restrict equipment for wood pole climbing. There's a few different components to your fall protection equipment. The components include your full body harness, which should be a class A, your lanyard, which is fixed length or adjustable, your lifeline, your rope grabs to attach the lanyard to the lifeline, and adequate anchorage. You have 4 different classes. Your body belt, which is a single or double D-ring, are designed to restrain a person in a hazardous work position to prevent fall or to arrest a fall completely within 3 feet of movement. The amends must be made to always keep the line rigid, and a harness should also be used. Your class 2 is your chest harnesses, which are used when there are only limited fall hazards. There's no vertical free fall hazard, or for retrieving persons such as removal of persons from a tank or a bin. Your class 3 is a full body harness, which is designed to arrest the most severe free falls. And class 4 suspension belts, which are independent work supports used to suspend a worker, such as a boat swing chair or raising or lowering harnesses. So let's talk about inspection, cleaning, maintenance, repairs, and disposal. So PPE must be inspected as part of a proper maintenance program. You need to make sure that it's inspected prior to use. You may need to inspect it during the use and when it's removed. You need to check for any damages to any shell, casing, or overall condition. And when you're using things such as your respirators, check your cartridges and inserts as needed. For fall protection equipment, make sure you're checking for any rips or tears or any issues with the overall integrity of the equipment. PPE must be cleaned regularly if it's not disposable. If it is disposable, it needs to be disposed of immediately upon completed use. Make sure you clean your PPE after each use or after each shift, or when dirt or debris cause the PPE to not have proper protection. This is specifically important for things such as your lanyards and fall protection, as well as your respirators. PPE must be maintained on a regular basis based on a schedule. In some cases, schedules are required for things such as cartridges for respirators as well as fall protection, and they need to be implemented in the workplace. Make sure the schedules are created, make sure they're maintained, and make sure they're followed. If there are any defects found, make sure proper repairs are made, including enlisting the services of a specialized competent person to make the repair. Most PPE, in order to have it properly repaired, needs to be sent back to a manufacturer to have it recertified. If you are using disposable PPE, make sure that you dispose of PPE in appropriate containers. Make sure PPE is disposed of in approved methods to reduce the impact on the environment. One of the things I see, unfortunately, is masks. You see them on the ground all over the place. I guess people just figure they'll just throw it on the ground and someone will clean it up. I mean, to me, that's absolutely unacceptable, but making sure that they're put into proper containers, proper bagged containers, so that the bag can be removed and disposed of properly. And do not use PPE that is damaged. Always make sure that it is tagged out of service or completely removed from the site from use. So the last thing I wanted to touch on is just your requirements as an employer. So the employer is required to assess the requirements for PPE in the workplace. This can be done through your proper hazard assessment that is done. Your hazard assessment will develop controls with regards to eliminating a hazard, substituting, administrative controls, and then, as I said in the beginning, your last line of defense is PPE, but it does need to be included in any assessment that is done. Always make sure that you're checking documentation such as your standards, regulations, and guidelines that apply to the workplace, checking safety data sheets for any chemicals that your workers will come into contact with, and specific policies and procedures that have been developed for the workplace specific to that type of work. Always make sure, as the employer, you're providing and maintaining PPE in good condition, and you need to make sure that any PPE that's damaged is removed out of service. So to kind of finish off the presentation here, we do have our contact info. If anybody has any questions with regards to PPE, what it is required for your workplace, please give either of us a call or send us an email, and we'd be happy to set up a time to come out and review your workplace and determine what PPE would be required. HeartSAP is also offering different types of PPE, so I'll let Ray take over here for a second to kind of explain that.
Yeah, so anything that you're going to need in the workplace, from PPE, from your masks, especially around medical masks, that is one of the things that we do carry. We do not carry the non-medical mask whatsoever. It's not something our business has ever done. We've always believed that a workplace should have, especially around COVID right now, should be wearing a medical mask where possible. We're not limited to them, and I know there was lots of talks when COVID started that they were in short demand. But to be honest, we were not in short demand by no stretch. Lots were getting to the hospitals, and they still are today. which is good to hear. So if you do need those, they're available. Of course, anything in the PPE from face shields to gloves, especially around nitriles and vinyls, we have all those things available to you to keep yourself safe. And I know somebody just asked a question in the chat. The summer camp guidance has been released. I haven't read that, so I really don't know anything about it yet. I did look prior to this, prior to our webinar starting, to see if anything was announced today, but it wasn't up till now. And obviously the camp guidance has been out. So yes, the government is definitely going to be vague. That's how they kind of operate a little bit, talking about you should wear a non-medical or medical mask. My preference, and been in this business for a long time, if you have access to medical masks, then that's definitely something you should be giving your staff and your campers. You want to give the best PPE possible to keep everybody safe and protected.
As an employer, you do have the responsibility to do everything reasonable under the circumstance to protect a worker. So if you are going to provide PPE, you do want to make sure that the PPE at minimum complies with the standards and requirements. But if you do go above and beyond, it is looked at from a liability standpoint as far better than just doing the bare minimum. So.
Yeah. And especially talking about the summer camps about masks, that's one thing to be very cautious. If you see pricing and it's kind of you can't believe it's you're getting it at such a good price. Sometimes that should bring up red flags as well. There's lots of masks that have come into Canada. The government of Canada was not able to control that piece, of course. So much came in that was not of good quality. And as they were able to get their fingers on the pulse a little bit, they started recalling a lot of different masks that came into the country. So be aware when you're making a purchase. You are still responsible as the employer to purchase the proper equipment that is approved to be in Canada. Because lots of stuff that come to Canada is not approved. And medical masks would be one of those things that that come in that have to have a Health Canada license to be able to distribute.
Yeah. One question I do always get asked from employers in my travels is, are we required to provide PPE to the worker, or can we require them to provide their own PPE? And my answer with this really is that the law states that the employer has to provide and maintain the equipment. If a worker brings their own equipment, the employer needs to make sure that it complies with the current standards and requirements. But an employer cannot turn around and tell a worker that they have to provide their own PPE to be able to work. I mean, there are different ways that you can set it up. You can provide stipends to your workers for certain types if they want to go out and buy something. But you do need to make sure that you're clear on the guidelines and requirements for what it needs to contain or how it needs to be set up. And you need to have it all documented and written in that format so that it is still the employer, you're providing it. The worker may just go and buy it and you may just reimburse the worker, sort of thing. Like, that's unacceptable. But you can't just tell the worker that they have to go and buy their own PPE in order to work, because one, the law doesn't say so, and that could cause you significant problems with the Ministry of Labor if the worker turns around and calls them.